Turn around, hands behind your back.
Wait, why?
You didn't stop, you kept going.
I slowed down and pulled.
Stop talking, turn around.
I'm not trying to fight you, I'm trying to explain.
Ethan.
It's okay, stay in the car.
This is why people need to understand their rights before a bad stop turns into a life-changing one. Broward County Deputy Ryan Mercer thought he was dealing with two scared teenagers he could pressure into silence on the side of the road. He did not expect the facts to start working against him almost immediately. And he definitely did not expect this stop to end with a lawsuit, a multi-million-dollar settlement, and his career blown apart. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you follow stories about abuse of power, legal accountability, and people keeping calm when an officer gets out of line, like this video, and subscribe. By the time the stop got serious, Ethan Carter was already in handcuffs, and his sister Maya was sitting in the car in shock. That's how fast it happened. Ethan was a high school student on his way to school with his younger sister. It was a normal morning in Broward County. He was driving. She was in the passenger seat. Nothing about that drive suggested they were about to get pulled into a police stop that would later cost the county $2 million. The problem started with something simple. Deputy Ryan Mercer wanted Ethan to stop, but he did not start with a clear traffic stop. He had no lights on, no siren, no unmistakable signal that any driver would immediately read as a command to pull over. He used a hand motion. Ethan saw that gesture and understood it as a signal to move over or change lanes. So he did exactly that. He kept driving in a normal way because he thought he had followed the instruction. That misunderstanding should have been easy to fix. A competent officer in that situation turns on the lights, hits the siren, makes the stop clear, and then figures out whether the driver was confused or refusing to comply. That is basic. Mercer did not handle it that way. He waited until later to activate the siren. The second Ethan heard it and realized this was an actual stop, he pulled over. That should have settled the issue. It should have become a routine traffic stop with a short explanation. Ethan could have told him he misunderstood the hand signal. Mercer could have checked the license, written a warning or citation if he wanted, and moved on. Instead, Mercer treated the stop like Ethan had committed a felony. He moved in aggressively, pulled Ethan out of the car, handcuffed him, and accused him of fleeing. He did not slow the situation down. He did not ask basic questions first. He did not give Ethan room to explain what had happened before turning physical. That decision changed everything. Now, this was no longer a traffic misunderstanding. Now a teenager on his way to school was standing on the roadside in handcuffs while a deputy pushed a felony accusation that did not match the facts. Ethan tried to explain. He said he did not know Mercer wanted him to stop earlier. He said he thought the hand motion meant move over, not pull over. He said he stopped as soon as the siren came on. Mercer did not listen. That matters because this is where officers either correct a mistake or make it worse. Mercer had enough information to realize Ethan's explanation made sense. There had been no lights or siren at first. The driver had stopped once the stop became clear. There was no obvious sign of panic, no wild driving, no effort to get away. But Mercer had already decided he was dealing with felony flight. And once he locked himself into that position, he treated Ethan's explanation like a challenge instead of evidence. Maya was watching all of this from the passenger seat. She saw her brother pulled out of the car and cuffed on the way to school. She heard the deputy talking to him like he was some dangerous suspect. At that point, she stopped thinking this was a misunderstanding that would clear itself up. She understood something was wrong, so she called their mother. That call made Mercer even more hostile. Their mother was Danielle Carter, a federal judge. Maya reached out because she needed help, and because the stop had already gone beyond anything that looked normal. Once Mercer found out who was on the phone, he did not calm down and make sure every step he took was legally solid. He got more aggressive. That told everyone exactly what kind of stop this had become. He argued with their mother on the phone instead of sticking to the facts of the stop. He turned the situation personal. Then he took Maya's phone even though she was not a threat and was not creating any danger. That was a major mistake. Maya was a frightened teenager calling her mother while her brother was in handcuffs. Taking her phone did not make the scene safer. It did not help Mercer investigate anything. It showed he wanted control more than clarity, and the facts were already moving against him. There was no legal basis for treating Ethan like a fleeing felon. Ethan had not taken off after a clearly marked stop. He had not ignored lights and siren. He had not kept driving after the stop became unmistakable. He pulled over once Mercer activated the siren. On top of that, there was no criminal issue on his license that explained some desperate attempt to escape. Mercer was trying to force a serious charge onto a situation that did not support it. Ethan stayed focused and kept giving the same explanation. He had misunderstood the gesture. He had not run. He had stopped when the siren came on. Mercer had a problem now. The longer he held onto the felony story, the worse it looked. Every minute made it harder to explain why he had skipped normal procedure and gone straight to force. At some point, he had to back off. He removed the handcuffs. That move made one thing clear. Mercer could not support the arrest he had started. If Ethan had really fled from a lawful stop, that case would not disappear on the roadside after a few checks and a few minutes of pressure. Mercer had gone too far and knew it. But he still did not admit it. Instead, he wrote a citation. That was not a real fix. It was an attempt to leave the scene with something official in his hand after the felony accusation fell apart. Ethan and Maya were still left with the same reality. Ethan had been yanked out of the car, cuffed, and accused of a felony on the way to school. Maya had been frightened, cut off from her mother, and forced to watch the whole thing happen. A citation did not undo any of that. By the time the stop ended, both teenagers understood they had just been through something far more serious than an officer losing his temper for a minute. This was abuse of authority dressed up as enforcement. And Mercer had made another mistake he probably did not appreciate yet. He had created a stop that could be checked from every direction. The timing of the signals, the lack of lights and siren at the start, Ethan stopping once the siren came on, the handcuffs, the felony accusation, the phone call with their mother, the seizure of Maya's phone, the final retreat from arrest to citation. That kind of stop does not stay buried if the family has the means and the discipline to challenge it. The Carters did. Once they got home and laid out what happened step by step, this was no longer just a bad morning on the road. It was the beginning of a case that would put Mercer's decisions under a microscope and force Broward County to answer for what he did. Once the Carter family got home, they did not treat this like a bad traffic stop that would fade after a few angry conversations. They treated it like a case. That was the right move. A lot of people lose these situations before they even begin because they rely on outrage instead of structure. They tell the story emotionally, skip details, and leave room for the officer's report to become the official version. The Carters did the opposite. They started locking down the timeline. Ethan explained the drive from the beginning. He described the first moment he noticed Mercer, the hand motion, what he thought it meant, and the point when the siren finally came on. Maya filled in what she saw from the passenger seat. She described the stop from her angle, Ethan getting pulled out, the handcuffs, Mercer's tone, the phone call to their mother, and Mercer taking her phone. Their mother already knew what mattered. Not assumptions, not dramatic language, sequence, exact actions, exact timing. What signal came first? When Ethan pulled over, what Mercer said the basis was. When the handcuffs went on, when they came off, why Maya's phone got taken, what citation got written after the felony claim collapsed. That's how a weak police narrative starts falling apart, piece by piece. Danielle Carter also understood something else. A deputy can say a driver fled. That does not make it true. If the stop began with no lights, no siren, and only a vague hand motion, the whole legal theory gets shaky fast. If the driver then pulls over once the siren comes on, it gets even worse for the deputy. If the deputy reacts by escalating, grabbing, cuffing, and pushing a felony accusation without solid grounds, then the department has a serious problem. The family moved quickly, and they preserved everything they could. Notes, call history, the citation, their own memory while it was still fresh. That mattered because details disappear fast after adrenaline wears off. People start rounding things off. Times blur together. Sequences get less precise. The Carters did not let that happen. Then they pushed the complaint forward. This is where a lot of departments hope people get tired. They count on families backing off after the first emotional crash. They count on fear, delay, and the usual feeling that fighting law enforcement is too expensive, too slow, too stacked against normal people. Mercer probably thought this would end that way too. He had the badge. He had the first shot at the report. He had the usual advantage officers get when a roadside stop turns into paperwork. But this was not a family that was going to let a false version settle into the record. The internal review process started with the same basic issue Mercer should have solved on the roadside. What exactly made him think Ethan had committed felony fleeing? That question did not help him, because now he had to explain why a hand motion without lights or siren was supposed to count as a clear command to stop. He had to explain why Ethan pulling over once the siren came on did not end the matter. He had to explain why he jumped past ordinary traffic stop procedure and went straight to force. He had to explain why Maya's phone got taken. He had to explain why the stop ended with a citation instead of the felony arrest he had acted out in real time. The more people looked at it, the worse it got. That is usually how these cases work. The stop may look confusing in the moment, because one side has all the authority and all the pressure is flowing one way. Later, once the emotion gets stripped out and the sequence gets reviewed, the bad decisions start standing alone. Clean. Hard to defend? Mercer had made several. First, he failed to make the stop clear at the start. That set up the misunderstanding. Second, once Ethan stopped after the siren, Mercer treated the earlier confusion like proof of criminal intent, instead of checking whether the explanation fit the facts. Third, he escalated physically before establishing a sound legal basis for the arrest posture he was taking. Fourth, he made the stop worse after learning who their mother was. That part was especially ugly because it suggested this was no longer about enforcement. It was about pride. Fifth, he grabbed Maya's phone even though she posed no threat. Each one of those decisions had its own problem. Together, they painted a very bad picture. The family's legal team saw it the same way. This was not just a bad judgment call. It was a false arrest and an excessive force claim with emotional distress consequences built into the facts. Ethan had been handcuffed and accused of a felony without a lawful basis. Maya had been aggressively detained in the middle of an already chaotic stop and cut off from her mother, even though she had done nothing wrong. That is how a traffic stop becomes civil liability. And once lawyers get involved, officers lose one big advantage. They no longer get to rely on tone and presence. Nobody cares about roadside swagger in a lawsuit. The case becomes documents, testimony, policy, timing, and whether the officer's story still holds together when every step gets tested. Mercer's did not. The complaint laid out the core issue clearly. Ethan had not fled. He had misunderstood an unclear gesture before any lights or siren were used. He stopped once the siren came on. Mercer then used force without proper justification, escalated the situation, and interfered with Maya while she was trying to contact their mother during a stop that was already out of control. That is a strong case because it does not rely on exaggeration. It relies on sequence, and sequence is hard to spin. The county had to look at more than Mercer's initial claim now. They had to think about what a jury would see if this went all the way. two students on a school commute, a deputy using a vague gesture instead of a clear stop, a siren coming later, a teenager pulling over once the stop became obvious, immediate handcuffing, a felony accusation that did not match the facts, a sister calling her mother in fear, a federal judge on the phone, the deputy getting more hostile, not less. Then the retreat from arrest to citation. That story had a very obvious weakness. It made Mercer look like he was trying to force the facts to fit his reaction. Departments hate cases like that because they are hard to clean up. And there was another problem for Mercer. Even if someone wanted to defend the initial misunderstanding as a split-second judgment issue, the later decisions kept making things worse. He had opportunities to correct course. More than one. He did not take them. That matters in these cases. A single bad read can sometimes be explained. Repeated escalation after new facts come in is harder to excuse. Ethan and Maya also had to deal with the personal side while all this was building. That part gets overlooked a lot, but it matters. Ethan still had to go back to school after being treated like a criminal on the way there. Maya still had to live with the memory of watching her brother cuffed while an armed deputy took over the scene. These stops do not end when the patrol car leaves. They stay with people. The embarrassment stays. The anger stays. The change in how safe, ordinary things feel stays. The family did not let that part get minimized. They made clear that this was not only about a bad charge or an improper citation. It was about what Mercer did to two teenagers during a routine morning and what that kind of conduct does to a person after the scene is over. That raised the stakes. Now, the county was not just looking at whether Mercer had made a technical error. They were looking at false arrest, excessive force, emotional distress, and a fact pattern that could play very badly in public if it ever moved beyond legal filings and into wider attention. Mercer was no longer controlling the story. That shift matters. On the roadside, he had total control. He controlled the tone, the movement, the pressure, and the immediate consequences. Afterward, control started moving away from him. Into records, into policy review, into legal claims, into a setting where authority means less than proof, and proof was becoming a problem for him. By this point, the family was not asking whether they should act. They were already acting. The real question was how far this would go, and whether Broward County would fight the case or try to make it disappear before more damage hit the department. Because once the paperwork, testimony, and review started lining up, one thing was becoming clear. Ryan Mercer had turned a simple misunderstanding into a case that could cost the county a lot of money and cost him his job. The lawsuit forced the county to deal with the stop as it actually happened, not as Mercer tried to frame it on the roadside. The main issue was simple. Ethan did not flee. Mercer had not made a clear stop at first. He used a hand motion without lights or siren. Ethan read that as a signal to change lanes and kept going. Once the siren came on, he pulled over. That sequence destroyed the felony theory. Mercer had treated confusion as intent. That was the first major problem. The second was what he did after Ethan stopped. Instead of handling it like a traffic stop, he pulled Ethan out, handcuffed him, and accused him of a felony. By the end of the stop, he had to remove the cuffs because there was no solid basis for that arrest posture. Then there was Maya. She called their mother because she was scared by what Mercer was doing. Mercer responded by arguing on the phone and taking Maya's phone even though she was not a threat. That made the stop worse and widened the case. The family sued over false arrest, excessive force, and emotional distress. Those claims fit the facts. Ethan had been detained like a fleeing suspect without legal grounds. Maya had been aggressively controlled during a stop where she had done nothing wrong. The county had to look at the full sequence, and the full sequence was bad for Mercer. His actions created a clear pattern. He misread the situation, escalated too fast, refused to correct himself, then tried to leave the scene with a citation after the felony accusation fell apart. That did not hold up. The case ended with a $3 million settlement for Ethan and Maya. Mercer was fired for gross misconduct. That outcome settled the core issue. Ethan was not a student who ran from police. He was a student wrongly arrested after a deputy turned a misunderstanding into a power move. Maya was not just standing nearby. What Mercer did to her counted too. The settlement closed the legal case, but it also made the result public, in the only way that really matters in cases like this. The county paid $3 million to Ethan and Maya Carter. That number mattered because it showed the case was serious. This was not treated like a minor stop or a small judgment error. The county was paying for false arrest, excessive force, and the harm Mercer caused both teenagers during a routine school drive. Mercer was also fired for gross misconduct. That ended the other argument too. He was not leaving this as a deputy who made a tough call under pressure. He lost his job because his conduct could not be defended once the facts were reviewed in order. For Ethan, the result corrected the record. He was never a fleeing suspect. He was a student who misunderstood an unclear hand motion, stopped once the siren came on, and got treated like a felon by a deputy who refused to slow down and assess the situation properly. For Maya, the outcome mattered because what happened to her was recognized as part of the abuse, not some extra detail around Ethan's stop. She was frightened, aggressively controlled, and had her phone taken even though she was not a threat. That is what made this case bigger than one bad stop. Mercer had all the power at the start. He had the badge, the roadside control, and the ability to force his version in real time. The Carters beat that by doing the opposite of what he expected. They stayed calm, kept the sequence straight, and challenged every part of the story that did not match the facts. That is why this case still matters. A deputy tried to turn confusion into felony flight. He tried to use force to hold that version together. He failed because the timeline was clear, the family acted fast, and the law did not support what he did. That is the lesson here. Knowing your rights does not always stop abuse in the moment, but it can stop abuse from becoming the official story afterward. What would you have done if you were Ethan or Maya in that car? Put your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with somebody who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like this.
What's the reason?
We got a call, and I assume you're too
A
suspicious.
call for what exactly? What did you personally observe?
Sir, you're under arrest for not cooperating. Hands behind your back.
This is a picnic. You're doing this because I wouldn't just say.
This is why people need to understand their rights before a police encounter gets out of control. Officers surrounded a family during a weekend picnic and acted like they were dealing with a threat, but the father knew exactly how far police authority could legally go. The stop looked routine for about a minute. Then it turned into a serious mistake with witnesses, recordings, and a chain of decisions that would later be impossible to explain away. If you're watching, comment where you're from. If you care about real accountability, when officers push past the law, like the video and subscribe. It happened at a public park in a suburban city on a normal weekend afternoon. Families were spread across the grass. Kids were near the playground. Some people were walking dogs, others were eating lunch, and nothing in the area suggested any kind of danger or disorder. The family at the center of the incident had a blanket, food containers, drinks for the children, and a small speaker playing quietly. The father was helping one child with a kite, while the mother was arranging lunch. Everything about the scene was ordinary. Then several patrol vehicles entered the lot. That already told people nearby this was not being handled as a casual check. When multiple officers arrive at once, the tone changes before anyone even speaks. The officers got out with purpose and walked directly towards the family. They were not scanning the area to figure out what had happened. They were moving as if they had already decided this family was the problem. The reason for the response was a weak complaint dressed up as something more serious. Dispatch had received a suspicious activity call about a family near the playground. The caller claimed the adults were making others uncomfortable and possibly arguing with people in the area. It was vague, and that mattered. Calls like that often reflect bias, exaggeration, or simple annoyance rather than actual criminal conduct. Any officer who arrived and looked at the situation objectively should have recognized that fast. The sergeant who led the contact did not. He focused on the father almost immediately. He did not start with broad questions to find out what had happened. He did not ask nearby park-goers whether there had been any actual disturbance. He approached like he already believed the complaint and only needed the father to confirm it somehow. The father stood up as the officers approached. He kept his hands visible and asked a direct question about what the issue was. The sergeant gave him a vague answer about a complaint and park safety. The father then asked what specific conduct had led to the stop. That should not have been a difficult question. If police are approaching someone based on suspicious activity, they should be able to describe what that suspicious activity actually was. The sergeant did not do that. He stayed general and acted like the request for clarity was itself a problem. The mother stayed close to the children and watched carefully. She was not arguing. She was not interfering. She was trying to keep the situation calm while the officers formed a loose circle around the picnic area. That move changed the scene. What had started as a family outing now looked like a detention in front of strangers. The father asked whether he was free to leave or being detained. That is one of the clearest questions a person can ask in an encounter like this. It forces the officer to define the stop. A professional answer would have narrowed the legal issue right there. Instead, the sergeant avoided the question and told him to step away from the blanket. The father asked again whether he was under lawful detention. The sergeant repeated the command with a sharper tone. That exchange mattered because it showed where the situation was going. The father was trying to establish the legal basis for the encounter. The sergeant was trying to control movement first and explain later. That is where a lot of bad stops start. The officer treats calm questions as defiance and starts escalating because he does not like being challenged. A few people nearby had started watching by then. Some raised their phones and began recording. The father did not perform for them or try to turn the moment into a speech. He stayed focused on the same simple points. Why were they being approached? What specific complaint had been made? Were they being detained? What legal grounds supported it? He kept the questions narrow because narrow questions are hard to bury later in a report. The officers then asked for identification. The father asked what crime they were investigating. Again, there was no clean answer. The sergeant relied on broad phrases about an investigation and the need to cooperate. That kind of wording sounds official, but it often hides the fact that the officer has not established a real basis for the detention. By then, the officers had already seen the family, the food, the children, the blanket, and the lack of any threatening behavior. There was still no visible offense, no disturbance, no sign of intoxication, no aggression, nothing that matched the tone of the response. The mother then raised her phone and began recording openly. The sergeant noticed immediately and warned her not to interfere. She was standing with her children and documenting the stop. That was lawful. Her decision to record made the officers more cautious in some ways, but it also seemed to irritate the sergeant. He was now dealing with a father asking precise legal questions and a mother preserving the entire interaction on video. That combination often exposes sloppy policing in real time. The father repeated his question about whether he was being detained. This time, the sergeant said he was being detained, while officers sorted things out. That sounded procedural, but it was legally weak. Police cannot detain someone just to sort things out unless they can point to facts supporting reasonable suspicion of a crime. The father understood that immediately and asked what specific facts justified the detention. The sergeant did not have a strong answer. He shifted to officer safety language. That was not supported by the scene either. The father had not threatened anyone. He had not reached into pockets, made sudden movements, or tried to leave. He had simply stood near his family and asked lawful questions in a public park. Another officer stepped closer and reached for the father's arm. The mother responded by pulling the children back and keeping the phone trained on the officers. She did not rush forward. She did not create a physical confrontation. She stated clearly that her husband was not resisting and that the stop was being recorded. That was smart. Clear audio from a calm witness often becomes more valuable than the video itself. The father did not pull away or give the officers anything they could later describe as resistance. He let the scene unfold exactly as they were choosing to create it. The officers then placed him in handcuffs in front of his wife, his children, and several people in the park who were already filming. That changed everything. At that point, this was no longer a vague park inquiry. It was now a public detention of a calm father over an unverified suspicious activity complaint that still had not been explained in concrete terms. One of the children started crying. The mother stayed controlled, but it was obvious she was angry and focused. The sergeant kept insisting they were conducting a lawful detention. The problem for him was simple. He had used force and restraints before clearly establishing facts that would justify either. By then, the officers still believed they were in control of the stop. They had not yet understood who the father was, or how well he understood the law. They also had not thought far enough ahead to realize what multiple recordings, witness statements, body camera footage, and dispatch logs were going to look like once those pieces were reviewed together. The sergeant kept acting like pressure would settle the matter. It wouldn't. Once the officers put the father in handcuffs, the stop became much harder to defend. Up to that point, the sergeant could still pretend he was checking a complaint. After the cuffs went on, every decision had to match a real legal basis. That was where the problem started getting serious. If you're watching, comment your city. If you want more stories about bad stops and real accountability, like the video and subscribe. The father stayed calm. He did not argue for effect. He kept asking the same direct questions. Was he under arrest or only detained? What specific crime were they investigating? What facts gave them grounds to handcuff him in front of his family? The sergeant did not answer clearly. He kept using broad phrases about an investigation and officer safety. That was weak. The officers had arrived to a family picnic, not a fight, not a threat, not a crime in progress. The wife kept recording. She said clearly that her husband had not resisted and that officers still had not identified an actual offense. A couple of people nearby recorded from different angles. That mattered because the scene was now documented from several sources, not just police body cams. The sergeant then had another officer move the father away from the blanket and closer to the patrol cars. That made the detention look even worse. The children were already upset, and now they were watching their father being separated from them over a complaint nobody could explain properly. The father kept pressing the same point. He asked whether the detention was based on officer observations, a witness statement, or just his refusal to obey commands that had no clear legal basis. The sergeant had no strong answer. He started talking more, but the content stayed thin. Then one of the officers asked for identification again. This time the father agreed and provided it carefully. The younger officer checked the ID, looked back at the father, then looked at the sergeant. His body language changed immediately. He checked it again to make sure he had read it right. The father was a sitting federal judge. That was the moment the stop changed. The sergeant stepped in, looked at the identification, and understood the situation at once. His tone dropped. His posture changed. He was still trying to look in control, but the confidence was gone. A minute earlier, he had acted like the father was just another person he could pressure. Now he knew the man in handcuffs understood constitutional law better than anyone on scene. The father did not raise his voice. He did not grandstand. He simply laid out the problem. He said they had detained him without clearly stating a crime, handcuffed him without a real safety basis, and treated a lawful family picnic like suspicious conduct because somebody made a vague complaint. He made it clear that discomfort from a caller did not automatically create police authority. The wife kept filming the officers as they reacted. That part was important too. Once police realize who a person is and suddenly change tone, it raises an obvious question later. If the stop was lawful before the identification, why did everything shift after it? The sergeant called for a supervisor. That call came late. It also showed he knew the stop was slipping away from him. The children were still shaken. The younger one was crying. The older one stayed close to the mother and watched everything. The wife then asked whether her husband would have been treated the same way if he had not known the law and if she had not recorded the stop from the start. Nobody answered that. A supervisor arrived a short time later. He took one look at the father in cuffs, the wife filming, the kids upset, and the people nearby recording. He could see this was already bad. The sergeant started explaining, but the explanation was short and it did not sound strong enough for what officers had already done. The father then broke the stop down in plain term: public park, no visible offense, no clear, reasonable suspicion, escalation after lawful questions, handcuffs without a credible safety reason. It was simple and hard to argue with. The supervisor listened, looked at the scene again, and made the only decision left. He ordered the cuffs removed. Once the cuffs came off, the officers lost the argument that this had been a clean detention. Taking the cuffs off that fast did not solve the problem. It showed the problem was real. If you're watching, drop your city in the comments. If you want more stories where bad decisions meet real scrutiny, like the video and subscribe. The supervisor stepped in and tried to slow everything down. He asked the father if he was hurt and said they wanted to sort out what had happened. That was an attempt to regain control of the scene before more damage was done on camera. The father did not let the conversation drift. He kept it focused on the main issue. He said the officers had detained him in a public park without clearly identifying a crime, handcuffed him in front of his wife and children, and escalated after he asked basic legal questions. He kept it simple because simple facts are harder to hide later. The supervisor then asked the sergeant what conduct had justified the detention. That was the question that mattered most. Not what dispatch said, not what a caller felt, what the officers themselves had seen after arriving. The answer was weak. The sergeant referred to the complaint, the father's refusal to move when ordered, and general officer safety. None of that sounded strong enough for handcuffs. The father had not threatened anyone. He had not tried to run. He had not acted aggressively. He had stood near his family and asked why police were stopping him. The father then said exactly what the officers did not want said out loud. He said they had turned a vague complaint into a detention first and had started looking for legal justification after that. He said the sequence was obvious. They arrived, focused on his family, escalated, and only then tried to explain it. That was hard to answer because it matched the scene. The wife stepped in next. She asked the supervisor whether all body camera footage would be preserved, whether dispatch audio from the original call would be saved, and whether every officer on scene would be identified in the report. That put the conversation where it belonged, not on feelings, on evidence. The supervisor answered more carefully than the sergeant had. He said the footage would be retained and that the incident would be reviewed. He was speaking like someone who already understood internal affairs was now part of the story. Nearby witnesses were still filming. A few of them had heard enough to understand what had happened. One woman said the father had been calm the whole time. Another witness said the officers had shown up ready to force a problem before they had confirmed there was one. Comments like that matter because they do not come from the family or the department. They come from people with no reason to shape the story for either side. The supervisor then tried to soften the scene by calling it a misunderstanding that escalated too quickly. The father shut that down immediately. He said there had been no misunderstanding on his side. His family had been eating lunch in a public park. Officers arrived and treated that as suspicious without identifying actual unlawful conduct. He said that was not confusion. It was a decision. That distinction mattered. The wife then asked the officers to step back from the children. The supervisor finally told them to widen the space and stop crowding the blanket area. That should have happened much earlier, but it was the first move that actually reduced the pressure around the family. The father then made another point that cut off an easy excuse. He said his title should not matter. He said the stop had to be lawful before the officers knew who he was. That was important because it blocked the department from later framing the case as a special situation involving a prominent person. He was making the opposite point. If the detention was wrong, it was wrong because of what they did to an ordinary family. Before identification changed the tone. The sergeant had very little to say by then. Earlier, he had controlled the scene. Now he was mostly standing back, while the supervisor handled the fallout. That alone told people a lot. The father requested names, badge numbers, and the incident reference. He also made it clear that dispatch logs, body camera footage, and witness recordings would all matter later. He was not threatening anyone. He was telling them what was obviously coming next. The supervisor gave a short apology for the distress caused. The father did not debate it. He said the department would have a chance to address the stop through formal channels. That answer told the officers this was not ending with a sidewalk apology and a quiet departure. The family packed their things slowly and kept recording until they were ready to leave. That was smart. The stop may have ended, but the evidence gathering had not. By the time they walked away, the officers were no longer dealing with a field contact. They were dealing with a record. After the family left, the park incident moved out of the field and into the system. That was where the officers had a bigger problem. Out in public, they could rely on tone, positioning, and vague commands. In review, none of that helps. Review looks at sequence, legal bases, footage, radio traffic, and written reports. The stop was weak on all of it. If you're watching, comment your city. If you want more real stories about accountability, when authority gets abused, like the video, subscribe, and stay with the channel. The first issue was the call itself. Dispatch records showed a vague, suspicious activity complaint, not a report of violence, theft, threats, or trespassing. That already made the aggressive response look excessive. Then the body camera footage made things worse. The officers arrived to a family picnic, saw no obvious crime, got lawful questions from the father, and escalated anyway. That sequence is hard to defend because it shows the detention grew out of assumption, not clear facts. The second problem was the handcuffing. Once the father was restrained, the department needed a clear explanation for why officers believed that level of force was necessary. The footage did not show aggression. It did not show resistance. It did not show an immediate safety threat. It showed a calm father asking what law he had broken while standing near his wife and children. The third problem was the timing of the tone shift. Multiple recordings captured the same pattern. Before identification, the sergeant acted forceful and dismissive. After officers realized the father was a sitting federal judge, the tone changed fast. That did not help the department at all. It made the scene look exactly like what the family later alleged. Officers were comfortable pushing past legal limits until they realized the person in cuffs had the knowledge and position to hold them accountable. The family filed a formal complaint quickly. They did not rely on public outrage alone. They preserved the videos, identified witnesses, requested records, and built the case the right way. The complaint focused on unlawful detention, improper use of restraints, unequal treatment in a public space, and the failure to articulate reasonable suspicion before escalating. It also pointed to the emotional impact on the children, which mattered because departments often try to treat family harm as secondary when it is part of the real damage. Then came the legal side. The father's team prepared a federal civil rights action against the department and the officers involved. The claim was straightforward. Police cannot detain and restrain people in a public park over a vague complaint without specific facts supporting the stop. They also cannot turn lawful questions into justification for escalation. The family argued that the officers acted first and searched for legal cover afterward. Based on the sequence, that claim had weight. Internal Affairs opened an investigation. The sergeant was placed on administrative leave, while footage reports and dispatch records were reviewed. Another officer on scene was removed from field duty during the inquiry. The supervisor was not accused of causing the stop, but his response became part of the review because investigators wanted to know why supervisory intervention happened only after the detention had already gone bad. The department tried the usual public language at first. They said they'd take all complaints seriously. They said the matter was under review. They said they are committed to professional policing. That kind of statement buys time, but it does not fix footage. Then more facts came out. Witness statements supported the family's account. Video angles matched each other. The timeline was consistent. The father had asked clear legal questions. The officers had failed to identify a concrete offense before using handcuffs. The children had been present the entire time. The tone shift after identification was obvious. By that point, the department was no longer deciding whether the stop looked bad. It was deciding how much damage it could contain. The sergeant's employment did not survive it. He was terminated after the review concluded that the detention was not supported by a properly articulated legal basis and that his escalation decisions violated department policy. The termination was not presented as a political sacrifice. It was framed as a policy and judgment failure. That wording mattered because it meant the department could not defend the stop on the merits. The father later made a public statement, and it cut directly to the issue. He said his title was never the point. The Constitution was supposed to protect his family before the officers knew who he was. He said the real question was how many families without recordings, witnesses, or legal knowledge had already been treated the same way and never managed to prove it. That statement landed because it turned the story from one family's case into a broader indictment of how vague complaints and officer assumption can become unlawful detention. The case also pushed for reform. The family called for stricter detention review standards, mandatory body camera preservation in all public contact complaints, and better training on reasonable suspicion, public space enforcement, and recording rights. Those reforms were not abstract. They were tied directly to what happened in the park. For viewers, the lesson is simple. Stay calm. Ask if you are being detained. Ask what law officers believe applies. Do not physically resist. Record if local law allows it. Keep your hands visible. Try to get badge numbers, unit numbers, witnesses, and timestamps. Do not argue in circles. Make officers define their actions clearly. That helps in the moment, and it helps even more later. This case started with a family eating lunch in a park. It turned into a detention because officers treated discomfort and assumption like legal authority. Then the entire thing collapsed once the facts had to stand on their own. That is how bad stops unravel. Not because officers suddenly become honest, because footage, timing, and clear facts leave them nowhere to hide. If you want more stories about abuse of authority, legal accountability, and the moments where power flips back to the people who know their rights, subscribe and stay with the channel.
Hands up, don't move. Who are you and what are you doing out here?
I'm waiting on someone. Why are you
You're
asking?
stalling. You're acting like you got something to hide.
I'm acting like a normal person who waits for someone.
You're in cuffs until I figure you out.
You just did damage you can't undo.
What happens when a high-stakes narcotic sting is ruined not by a criminal but by a fellow officer? A patrol cop let bias take over, targeted a black undercover FBI agent, and exposed him in the middle of an active operation. This was not a small mistake. It wrecked a federal case, put an agent in danger, and turned into the kind of lawsuit that ends careers. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you like stories about abuse of power, getting exposed and punished, like the video and subscribe. This one deserves your attention. The man at the center of it was FBI Special Agent Andre Carson. At the moment everything went wrong, Carson was sitting in a gray sedan near a line of warehouse units on the south side of the city. He had been undercover for months inside a narcotics network that moved fentanyl and cocaine across county lines. That night was supposed to be the final step before takedowns. A controlled buy was underway. Surveillance teams were in place. Local narcotics units were monitoring. Federal agents were waiting for the deal to move far enough to lock in the larger case. Then Officer Brett Hollis saw Carson's car and decided he had found his own stop. Hollis was a patrol officer, not part of the task force. He was the kind of officer who wanted activity on every shift and attention after every arrest. Supervisors liked his numbers. They ignored the complaints that followed him. Most of those complaints came from black drivers who said he escalated too fast, acted like suspicion was proof, and treated every stop like a personal challenge. Nothing serious had stuck to him yet. That made him even more confident. The operation had strict instructions that night. Marked patrol units were supposed to stay out of the area unless command requested them. Dispatch had already told patrol supervisors that sensitive law enforcement activity was happening around the warehouse corridor. Officers were not supposed to start random stops there. The reason was simple. One marked cruiser in the wrong place could kill the whole case. Hollis still inserted himself. He saw Carson's sedan moving slowly off the service road behind the warehouses and called it in. The plate came back clean. There was no warrant, no stolen hit, no urgent alert. He kept following anyway. He later claimed the driver looked nervous and out of place. That explanation fell apart later because Bodycam and dispatch logs showed he had nothing concrete when he decided to act. Carson noticed the patrol vehicle almost immediately. He could not handle the stop the way an ordinary federal agent would. 2 vehicles connected to the target group were still nearby. One sat near the loading area. Another was parked farther back with a clear view of the access road. Carson had spent months building credibility with men who trusted nobody. If they saw him openly identify himself to police, the case was finished. If they thought he was cooperating with law enforcement, the danger would go far beyond a failed arrest plan. When Hollis activated his lights, Carson had no good option. He pulled into an open section of pavement and stopped. He kept his movements controlled and visible. He tried to speak in a way that would alert a trained officer without exposing himself to the suspects who were still close enough to watch. He used phrases that should have made Hollis pause and reassess. He tried to slow the stop down. Hollis did the opposite. He came out hard and treated the scene like a felony takedown. He shouted commands, closed distance too quickly, and pointed his weapon at Carson before he had any real understanding of what he was interrupting. His body cam later showed that he was not investigating by that point. He had already decided what Carson was supposed to be. That decision mattered. Carson was a black man in an unmarked sedan in an industrial corridor after dark. Hollis saw that and built the rest in his own head. He did not see the operation. He did not see the possibility that another officer might be working. He did not see the tactical signs that the area was under active surveillance. He saw somebody he wanted to dominate in public. Carson tried again to get him to slow down. He told him, carefully, that this stop was creating a serious problem. He tried to direct Hollis toward checking with a supervisor. He avoided anything that would fully blow his cover in front of the men watching from nearby. Hollis took that as defiance. This is where officers like him become dangerous. They stop listening because they think control is the same thing as being right. Once that switch flips, everything becomes non-compliance. Every word becomes attitude. Every hesitation becomes guilt. Inside the command post, people were already realizing what was happening. Lieutenant Elena Ruiz, who was coordinating the local side of the task force, heard the traffic and knew a patrol officer had drifted into the middle of a sealed operation. She ordered dispatch to stop the contact. A patrol supervisor repeated the order. The message reached Hollis. He did not disengage. That point destroyed his defense later. He was not acting in confusion. He had been told to back off and kept going. At the same time, the drug deal was coming apart. The target group did not need a full explanation. They only needed to see their supposed buyer pinned down in headlights by a marked officer. One vehicle started moving out of the lot. Another cut away from the warehouse side and headed toward the main road. Surveillance units called out movement over the radio. Within seconds, the controlled buy was dead. Carson was still trying to manage two disasters at once. He had to survive an aggressive stop without giving the suspects a clean answer about who he was. Hollis kept pressing. He ordered Carson out of the vehicle. He ignored the warning signs in front of him. He ignored command. He ignored the possibility that he was about to destroy months of work. Then he got close enough to see equipment under Carson's jacket line. A careful officer would have paused there. Carson was not carrying himself like a street dealer. His setup did not match the picture Hollis had created. That should have forced a reset. Hollis doubled down instead. That is what pride looks like, when a man realizes he may be wrong but refuses to admit it. He escalated because backing off would have meant admitting he had made a bad stop. He cared more about winning the moment than understanding it. By then, the suspects had seen enough. The buyer they had been testing for months was now being treated like a criminal by uniformed police. Carson knew the case was gone. He also knew his face, his vehicle, and his value as an undercover agent were probably gone with it. Hollis moved in to put him in cuffs. That was the moment a patrol officer destroyed a federal narcotics operation, exposed a fellow law enforcement officer, and started the chain of events that would end his career. Hollis pulled Andre Carson out of the sedan and forced him onto the pavement while the operation died around them. That was the real damage. Not just the handcuffs. Not just the public humiliation. The suspects were watching a man they believed was a drug buyer get handled by uniformed police like he was dirty. In undercover work, that kind of scene does not create confusion. It creates certainty. Carson was burned. The surveillance team reported the first exit almost immediately. One target vehicle left through the rear access road. A second moved toward the highway. Then the communications line got worse. The primary seller had stopped answering. The courier phone went dark. A spotter vehicle that had been sitting 2 buildings over disappeared. Months of work started collapsing in less than a minute. Carson was on the ground trying to protect what little he still could. He told Hollis as carefully as he could under the circumstances that he was interfering with an active law enforcement matter. He told him to get a supervisor to the scene. He tried to keep his words narrow because every extra detail made things worse if the suspects were still close enough to hear. Hollis kept pushing. His body cam later showed the problem clearly. He was not controlling a dangerous suspect. He was performing authority. He repeated commands Carson was already trying to follow. He spoke over him. He treated every attempt to slow the encounter as resistance. That is what made the footage so bad for the department later. The tone did not look professional. It looked personal. Then Lieutenant Elena Ruiz arrived. She came in fast, identified Carson, and ordered the cuffs off immediately. The recording captured the moment Hollis realized he had stopped the wrong man. He did not switch into concern. He did not ask what he had interrupted. He did what officers like him always do first. He defended himself. He said Carson had been suspicious. He said he was doing his job. He said nobody told him enough. That excuse was already dead. Dispatch logs showed he had been warned before the stop got aggressive. Radio audio showed a supervisor telling him to disengage. The task force command channel had already flagged the area as sensitive. Hollis had all the information he needed to back off. He chose not to. Ruiz was not subtle about what had just happened. She told him he had blown an active operation. She told him targets were already fleeing. She told him to stop talking and get out of the way. Carson got to his feet, but the damage was done. The men he had spent months getting close to were gone. So was the case structure built around him. That night should have ended with coordinated arrests, sealed evidence, and search warrants. It ended with frantic recovery work. Teams tried to pick up what they could. Highway units searched for vehicles that had already split in different directions. Surveillance reviewed last known movements. Analysts started freezing numbers tied to the target phones. None of it fixed the core problem. Leon Voss, the main target, had been cautious for years. Once he saw signs that law enforcement pressure had touched his circle, he adapted fast. By sunrise, stash locations were being cleared out. Burner phones were gone. One rented warehouse was emptied before a warrant team could get to it. The task force did not just lose a buy. They lost momentum, access, leverage, and the one undercover lane that had gotten them inside the organization. Carson paid the price first. He went straight from the scene into debriefing. Federal supervisors needed to know what the suspects had seen, what names had been used, what locations were now compromised, and whether he could safely stay in the field. The answer was obvious. He was done undercover in that case, probably done in that region for a long time. His face had been exposed in the worst possible context. Not as a police officer in a planned takedown, as a man being detained by uniformed patrol in front of criminals. People outside that work never understand how much that costs. An undercover identity is not a jacket you put on and take off. It takes months to build, sometimes longer. One careless patrol stop can wipe out years of credibility in one shot. Carson was furious, but not sloppy. He gave a clean statement. He documented every warning he had tried to give Hollis. He identified the exact point where the suspects would have understood the operation was compromised. He also made clear that this was not random bad luck. Hollis had no legal reason to force that stop into a takedown. He acted on an assumption, then escalated because he did not want to be challenged. Inside the local department, the reaction split almost immediately. The narcotics people were livid. They knew what had been lost. They had spent months supporting that case, coordinating with federal agents, and waiting for the operation to mature. To them, Hollis was the guy who stormed onto a chessboard, knocked over the pieces, and then acted like he deserved credit for showing initiative. Patrol leadership took a different tone. They started softening the language before the first reports were even finalized. The phrase they liked was miscommunication. That word showed up fast, too fast. It gave them cover. Miscommunication sounds procedural. It sounds shared. It spreads blame across the room. It avoids the real question, which was why Hollis saw a black man in an unmarked car and rushed to treat him like a felony suspect, even after multiple warnings told him to stop. Carson noticed that shift immediately. He also noticed something worse. Some people wanted him to help bury it. He was told the department needed time to review the evidence. He was told interagency relationships mattered. He was told everybody on the law enforcement side needed to avoid emotional reactions. That kind of language always means the same thing. They want the injured person to stay calm while the institution builds its escape route. Carson did not play along, but he was still boxed in for the moment. He had to protect federal procedures. He had to wait for official reviews. He had to sit through meetings where people talked about communication breakdowns instead of saying what happened plainly. A patrol officer ignored orders, profiled the wrong man, and wrecked an active operation. That was the truth. Everybody in the room knew it. Some were just more willing than others to say it. Then the footage started getting reviewed in full. That changed the temperature. Because once command saw the body cam next to dispatch audio and task force logs, the story got harder to smooth over. Hollis had not walked into a confusing scene and made an understandable mistake. He had driven the stop with his own ego from the beginning. He had been warned. He had been corrected. He had kept going. And there was one more problem for him. This was not his first complaint. The evidence killed the department's excuse. Once command reviewed the body cam with the dispatch logs and task force timeline, the story changed. Hollis had no traffic stop to justify what he did. No warrant hit, no emergency. He picked Carson, escalated fast, and ignored orders to stop. Then they checked his history. His prior stop showed the same pattern. Black drivers, aggressive tone. Thin reasons for the stop. Complaints that went nowhere. Supervisors had seen enough over the years to know he was a problem. They kept him on the street anyway. The department still tried to protect itself. Internal Affairs drafted a summary calling it a communication failure during a complex operation. That wording was not accidental. It spread blame around and took the focus off Hollis. Carson rejected it immediately. He told federal supervisors the stop was not caused by confusion between agencies. It started with profiling. Everything after that came from Hollis refusing to back off. The local department stalled. Hollis was pulled from patrol, but not fired. Command delayed decisions, meetings piled up, reports got rewritten. Nobody wanted to be the one who said the plain truth in writing. A patrol officer had racially profiled a black FBI agent, ruined an undercover case, and ignored direct warnings while doing it. Carson also got pushed aside. He was taken off field work connected to the case. Officially, they said his cover was burned and his safety had to come first. That part was true. The other truth was simpler. He had become a liability for people trying to keep the scandal contained. The narcotics case collapsed for good in the weeks after the stop. Leon Voss disappeared. Phones went dead. One storage site was cleared out before a warrant team reached it. Informants stopped calling back. The task force did not lose one transaction. They lost the case structure they had spent months building. That loss had a price. The failed sting burned surveillance work, overtime, informant payments, technical resources, and seizure plans. The cost climbed into the millions once the city counted wasted case development and the lawsuit risk that followed. Then Carson made the move that ended any chance of a quiet cleanup. He hired civil rights attorney Dana Mercer. Mercer treated the case exactly the way the department feared. Not as one bad stop, as a chain of misconduct, profiling, operational recklessness, supervisory failure, cover-up language after the fact. She moved fast. She demanded Bodycam, CAD logs, radio traffic, briefing records, stop data, prior complaints, training files, and internal drafts. She wanted to know what Hollis knew, when he knew it, and why the department kept softening the language. Depositions made it worse. Supervisors had to explain why Hollis stayed engaged after being told to disengage. Internal Affairs had to explain why early reports avoided the profiling issue. Command staff had to answer for years of ignored warning signs in Hollis's record. Hollis stuck to the same defense. He said Carson looked suspicious. He said he acted decisively in a dangerous area. That did not hold up because the recording showed he kept escalating after he had reasons to stop. Then he gave the answer that finished him. During sworn testimony, Hollis said he thought Carson was trying to manipulate the stop the way offenders often do. That line exposed the whole mindset. He had already placed Carson into a category before he knew who he was. After that, everything Carson said was filtered through that assumption. By that point, the city understood it had a serious problem. The stop could no longer be explained away as a patrol mistake. The record showed pattern. The footage showed escalation. The transcript showed ignored warnings. Carson had the evidence, the discipline, and the lawyer to force all of it into the open. And now the department had to decide whether it wanted to keep protecting Hollis or save itself. The city did not defend Hollis all the way through trial because the evidence was too bad. The body cam hurt him. The dispatch records hurt him more. The task force logs made it worse. He had been told to disengage and stayed in the stop anyway. That point never went away. The lawsuit ended in a major settlement. Carson's legal team argued that the stop cost him more than public humiliation. It destroyed months of undercover work, damaged his future operational use in that region, and put him at risk in front of narcotics targets. The city understood a jury would not like that story. A black FBI agent gets profiled by a local patrol officer. A federal case gets wrecked. And then the department tries to call it miscommunication. That was not a trial they wanted, so they paid. The exact number became a headline, because it was large enough to embarrass everyone involved. Bigger than most people expected. Big enough that local media stopped treating the case like an internal dispute and started calling it what it was, a preventable disaster. Hollis did not survive it. First, he was suspended. Then the department moved to terminate him. His past complaints came back into the record. His stop history got reviewed in full. His sworn testimony made him look worse, not better. He had no strong defense left. He lost his job. And after that, he lost his law enforcement certification. That was the real end. Getting fired is one thing. Losing certification means the career is dead. His supervisors did not walk away clean either. 2 command staff members were forced out after the report language, and delayed response came under review. Internal Affairs took heat for trying to soften the facts. Patrol leadership got hammered for years of ignored warning signs in Hollis's record. The department had spent too long protecting a problem officer because his numbers looked good on paper. That habit got expensive. Carson never got the case back. Leon Voss stayed gone long enough to break the operation for good. Other investigators eventually picked pieces of the network apart through separate cases, but the original federal sting was finished the night Hollis made that stop. Months of work were gone. Carson's cover was gone. That part could not be repaired by any settlement. What Carson did get was public vindication. He refused to let the department write the story for him. That mattered. A lot of officers are told to stay quiet for the sake of agency relationships or the chain of command. Carson went the other way. He documented everything, challenged the false narrative early, and forced the city to answer for what happened. Without that, Hollis probably gets a short suspension. The department buries the language, and everybody moves on. After the case, the department changed policy because it had to. Patrol officers got tighter restrictions around active federal and task force zones. Dispatch procedures changed. Mandatory verification steps were added before self-initiated stops near protected operations. Bias review on stop data got more serious because the city could no longer pretend that pattern complaints were random. Supervisors also lost some discretion to ignore repeated conduct flags from officers with aggressive histories. That was the only useful thing left to do. Admit the old system failed and lock some of those doors. The story stuck because the irony was brutal. A narcotics sting aimed at a drug network didn't collapse because the suspects outplayed investigators. It collapsed because one patrol officer saw a black man, trusted his own bias more than command, and thought the badge on his chest protected him from being wrong. It did not. It cost him his job. It cost him his certification. It cost the city millions. It exposed the department's instincts when one of their own caused the damage. And it proved something people keep learning the hard way. Ego inside a uniform can be just as dangerous as the threat officers claim they are stopping. That was the end of Brett Hollis as a cop. And for Andre Carson, the win was not clean, but it was real. He did not get his case back. He did not get those months back. He did get the truth on record, and he made sure the man who burned him could not hide behind the badge again. What would you have done in Carson's position? Stayed quiet or forced it into the open? Put your answer in the comments. Share this story with someone who thinks abuse inside law enforcement never gets punished. And subscribe for more stories like this. Police overreach keeps getting defended right up until the footage is too clear to spin. In this case, a patrol stop turned into a career-ending mistake when one officer pushed past the law, ignored valid documents, and picked the wrong driver to test. What made this one different was simple. The man behind the wheel wasn't just another citizen trying to get home. He was the head of internal affairs in the same department, and the officer had no idea. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you follow stories about police misconduct, civil rights, and real accountability, like and subscribe. Cases like this matter because most abuse of power only gets taken seriously when the evidence is impossible to hide. The stop started early evening on a busy city corridor near restaurants and office buildings. The vehicle was a dark Lamborghini Urus. The driver was Andre Bennett, black, early 40s, off-duty, dressed in a polo and slacks after a private business dinner. He wasn't speeding through traffic or drawing attention to himself. He was just driving an expensive SUV through the wrong part of town in the eyes of the officer who saw him. That officer was Tyler Voss. The moment Voss pulled in behind the Urus, the stop stopped being about traffic. He had already decided the driver didn't fit the vehicle. Everything after that came from that assumption. He approached the window and mentioned a traffic reason for the stop, but he didn't stay on it. His focus shifted right to the SUV and to Andre. He asked for license, registration, and insurance. Andre handed everything over without delay. The documents were valid. The vehicle was registered correctly. Insurance was active. The license matched. There was nothing unusual in the paperwork. Voss didn't accept that. He started asking ownership questions that had nothing to do with a normal stop. He wanted to know whose vehicle it really was, how long Andre had it, what he did for work, where he had been, and why he was driving in that area. He wasn't checking facts tied to the stop. He was looking for a crack somewhere else. Andre stayed calm. He answered what he had to answer and didn't give Voss more than the stop required. He knew the difference between a traffic inquiry and a fishing expedition. He also knew that once an officer stopped looking at the documents and started looking for a story, the encounter could turn fast. Voss went back to his cruiser and ran the information. Nothing supported his suspicion. The SUV wasn't stolen. Andre had no warrant. His license was clear. The insurance checked out. Registration was current. The stop should have ended there with a citation or a warning, depending on the original reason. Voss came back more aggressive. That told the whole story. He had checked the facts, and the facts had failed him. Instead of accepting that, he started trying to force the stop in another direction. He questioned Andre again as if the same valid documents had somehow become less valid in the last 2 minutes. He spoke like the paperwork itself was suspicious because it didn't match his assumption. He kept asking about money, work, and ownership. He treated a legal luxury vehicle like it was evidence by itself. Andre didn't react. That made Voss more confident. Officers like that often read self-control as weakness. They think calm means they can keep leaning. So Voss kept leaning. By then, people nearby had started paying attention. Traffic had slowed. A man waiting in a parked rideshare across the street began recording with his phone. A couple on the sidewalk slowed down when they saw Voss staying at the driver's window longer than a normal stop would require. Voss either didn't notice or didn't care. Andre still didn't tell him who he was. He wanted to see the stop for what it really was, not what it would become once rank entered the scene. If Voss was willing to do this to a driver with valid documents, then Andre had no reason to rescue him from his own choices. Voss asked for consent to search the vehicle. Andre refused. Clean refusal, no argument, no speech, just a lawful no. That should have settled it. Refusal to consent is not probable cause. Any officer knows that. Voss knew it too. He just didn't want the stop to end without proving himself right. His tone changed. He started using broad, weak language that sounds official until someone checks it. He mentioned officer safety. He hinted that Andre was being evasive. He suggested there were inconsistencies, but he couldn't point to one that mattered. He was building the usual excuse stack officers use when they want more authority than the law gives them. Andre asked the right question. He asked whether Voss had legal grounds for anything beyond the traffic stop. Voss didn't answer it directly. He ordered Andre out of the vehicle. Andre complied. He stepped out, closed the door, and stood where Voss directed him. He didn't give him attitude. He didn't make sudden movements. He didn't help him either. He simply followed the order and watched Voss keep pushing the stop past its limit. Voss continued asking questions that had already been answered. He implied there might be something illegal inside the SUV. He still had no clear basis for that claim. No odor, no contraband in plain view, no conflicting documents, no admission, no alert from a K-9, no specific fact that could support probable cause. He searched anyway. That was the decision that ended him. He moved into the vehicle without a lawful basis and started going through the interior as if he only needed to find one thing afterward to justify everything before it. That's not how the law works, and it's not how review boards look at stops once the video gets pulled. Andre told him the search was unlawful and requested a supervisor. Voss kept going. At that point, the stop was no longer a judgment call. It was misconduct on camera. The body cam captured Voss ignoring valid documents, stretching the stop, and treating refusal to consent like a reason to search. The dash cam captured the timeline. The bystander's phone video captured the tone from outside the car, which made the whole thing look worse. Voss had turned a routine stop into a personal challenge, and he was doing it in front of multiple cameras. Andre still did not reveal his position. Voss thought he was dealing with a driver he could pressure until something gave way. He had no idea he was minutes away from standing in front of the man who supervised internal misconduct investigations for the department. That reveal hadn't happened yet. The search came first. That was the part Voss would never be able to fix. Tyler Voss had already made the mistake that mattered. The unlawful search was on camera. Everything after that only made the fallout worse. Andre Bennett stood near the SUV and watched Voss keep moving through the interior like he could still rescue the stop by finding something. He checked the center console, looked through the front compartment areas, kept going long after it was obvious he was working backward from suspicion instead of forward from facts. Andre repeated that he wanted a supervisor. This time, Voss responded like a man getting irritated that the scene was no longer fully under his control. He still acted like he had time, like he could finish the search, lock in a report, and shape the story before anyone important showed up. That was his next bad read. A field supervisor, Lieutenant Elena Strickland, pulled up within minutes. She arrived expecting a routine assist on a traffic stop that had gotten tense. That changed fast. She saw Andre outside the vehicle, saw Voss still operating with too much heat, and saw the Lamborghini sitting open in a way that immediately raised the wrong questions. She asked Voss for the basis of the search. He gave her exactly the kind of answer that falls apart on review. He mentioned suspicious behavior, claimed the driver was evasive, referred to vague indicators. He spoke in generic language because generic language was all he had. He did not point to one clean fact that could justify entering the vehicle without consent. Strickland asked about the documents. Valid. She asked whether dispatch had returned anything on the vehicle or driver. Negative. She asked whether there was odor, contraband in plain view, a weapon concern, a warrant issue, or a K-9 alert. None. That was the moment the stop started collapsing in real time. Andre then gave his name in full. Not just the name on the license, his full department identity. He told Strickland he was Commander Andre Bennett, head of internal affairs. That landed exactly the way it should have. Strickland's expression changed first, not dramatic, just immediate. She knew what it meant, not because rank gave Andre special rights. It meant the department now had an off-duty command officer standing at the side of the road, directly alleging an unlawful search, with body cam rolling and at least one civilian recording from across the street. Voss froze for a second. That was the first honest moment he'd had all night. He realized he had not been controlling the stop. He had been documenting his own misconduct. Andre still didn't raise his voice. He didn't pull rank to threaten anyone. He didn't grandstand for the bystanders. He kept it clean. He stated that he had provided valid documents, denied consent, asked whether legal grounds existed for extending the stop, and then watched Voss search the vehicle anyway. He said the stop needed to be preserved exactly as it was, including all body cam, dash cam, radio traffic, and supervisor response times. That was a very bad sentence for Voss to hear, because now the scene had moved out of roadside argument territory and into evidence preservation. Strickland immediately told Voss to step back from the SUV. He tried to defend himself, claimed Andre's behavior raised red flags, claimed his training told him something was off, claimed he believed further investigation was justified. The problem was obvious. Belief wasn't enough, not for a search, not when every objective point had already cleared. The car was legal, the documents were legal, the driver was legal. Voss had turned a personal suspicion into police action and expected the uniform to carry him through the gap. It didn't. Strickland looked at Andre and asked one key question. Had there been consent at any point? Andre said no. That answer shut the door. The bystander across the street was still recording. A second person had started filming too. People didn't know who Andre was yet, but they knew what they were looking at. An officer had kept pushing a stop that didn't make sense, and a supervisor had just shown up to find him halfway inside a vehicle with no clear legal basis. Strickland then did what Voss should have expected from the beginning. She separated the scene. She directed another responding officer to remain with Andre. She pulled Voss aside. She asked for a direct timeline, not a speech. Why the stop started, what was observed, what facts developed, what specific legal threshold he believed he had met before entering the vehicle. His answers got worse when shortened. That happens a lot. Officers who lean on inflated reports usually sound stronger when they can bury weak facts under pages of wording. On scene with a supervisor asking short questions, the weakness shows immediately. What traffic violations started the stop? Minor and unclear. Minor. What developed after contact? Nothing concrete. What contradicted the documents? Nothing. What created probable cause? He could not say it cleanly because there was nothing clean to say. Andre stayed where he was and let the scene keep unfolding. He didn't need to help Voss fail. Voss was already doing that by himself. Strickland asked whether Voss had notified a supervisor before the search. He had not. Asked whether he sought consent more than once after the refusal. He had. Asked whether he documented any independent, articulable fact before entering the vehicle. He had not. That sequence mattered. It showed the real pattern. Voss had not discovered cause. He had tried to manufacture it. By then, another unit arrived. Then another supervisor. The stop had become a command issue. Not because Andre wanted theater, because the department now had exposure on multiple fronts at once. Possible civil rights violation, improper search, improper detention, false or inflated reporting risk, prior roadside footage from civilians. And one more problem nobody had spoken aloud yet. If Voss had done this with cameras everywhere, what had he done on stops with fewer witnesses? Andre finally gave Strickland the part that changed this from bad to catastrophic. He said he wanted all prior complaint history on Voss preserved and reviewed with the footage from the stop before anyone accepted a field explanation at face value. That hit because it told Strickland two things at once. First, Andre was not treating this like a personal insult. He was treating it like pattern misconduct. Second, there was a decent chance Voss already had a history. Voss heard that too. You could tell because his posture changed. The roadside confidence was gone. He stopped sounding like a patrol officer defending a hard call and started sounding like a man realizing the department might already know more about him than the scene itself showed. Strickland removed him from the active stop. Not suspended on the spot, not yet, but functionally done for the night. Another officer took over the scene documentation. Strickland informed Andre that the vehicle would not be touched further. She confirmed all video would be preserved. She requested command notification. She requested a formal administrative response. Andre gave one calm answer. He said that was the correct step. That was probably the worst part for Voss. Andre never gave him anger he could point to later. Never gave him a heated exchange to hide behind. The entire record showed one man staying controlled and another man pushing authority past the law because he didn't like what the driver represented. Before Andre left the scene, Strickland asked one final procedural question for the report. Did he intend to file a formal complaint? Andre told her this was already beyond a complaint. This was now an integrity review. That sentence finished the roadside part of the story. Because once internal affairs gets involved as a formal integrity matter, the officer's report is no longer the backbone of the case. The footage is. And the footage was terrible for Tyler Voss. The roadside part was over. The real damage started when the department pulled the footage and matched it against Tyler Voss's paperwork. That review moved fast. Not because the department suddenly cared about every bad stop. Departments rarely move that fast without pressure. This one moved because the victim was the head of internal affairs. The stop was captured from 3 angles, and the legal problem was obvious before anyone even wrote a summary memo. By the next morning, command staff had the body camera, dash cam, dispatch log, and the bystander video. They also had Voss's initial report. That report did not help him. He tried the usual repair job. He wrote that the driver's behavior raised suspicion. He claimed there were inconsistencies during the stop. He suggested the search followed developing indicators. On paper, he tried to make the encounter sound fluid and justified. On video, none of that held up. The footage showed Andre Bennett handing over valid documents right away. It showed no meaningful contradiction in his answers. It showed a calm refusal to consent. It showed Voss staying on the stop long after the traffic issue should have been resolved. Most important, it showed the search happening without any clear legal trigger. That alone was bad enough. Then Internal Affairs pulled Voss's complaint history. That changed the case from a single bad stop to a pattern. He had already been warned. Not once. More than once. The earlier complaints were not identical, but they all leaned the same way. Aggressive tone during routine stops, weak justification for prolonging contact, searches that pushed past the edge of lawful basis, drivers saying he treated them like suspects first and citizens second. In a lot of departments, that kind of record gets shrugged off until someone gets sued or a video goes public. This time, the department had both risk and proof sitting in the same file. Andre didn't personally run the review. That would have been sloppy and easy to attack later. He recused himself from direct handling and let the case move through formal channels. That mattered. It kept Voss from pretending this was personal retaliation. It wasn't. It was a misconduct case with unusually clean evidence. The review team started with the timeline. Why was the vehicle stopped? The original traffic basis was weak, but not the main problem. What happened after first contact? Valid license, valid registration, valid insurance. No warrant, no stolen vehicle return, no objective sign of criminal activity. What justified the extension of the stop? Nothing solid. What justified the search? Nothing lawful. That was the center of it. Once those answers were locked in, everything around Voss's report started looking worse. His wording wasn't just stretched, it looked engineered. He used broad phrases that officers use when they want discretion without facts. Training and experience, nervous behavior, inconsistent responses, officer safety concerns, suspicious circumstances. Those phrases can matter when they connect to actual observations. Here they were cover language. The video stripped them down. Command staff noticed something else. Voss's report sounded cleaner than the scene looked. That's always a bad sign. On camera, he looked irritated early and committed to escalation fast. In the report, he tried to sound measured. That gap matters in an administrative case because it suggests consciousness of guilt. He knew the stop looked bad, so he wrote around it. Then the bystander video made it even worse. Body camera footage often favors the officer by design. It sits on the officer's chest, captures what he faces, and misses how he looks to everyone else. The bystander angle gave the department the outside view. It showed how long Voss kept Andre at the roadside. It showed how often he stayed in Andre's space. It showed the search as something that did not follow a sudden discovery or emergency. It looked exactly like what it was: a patrol officer forcing a stop further and further because he couldn't accept being wrong. Once that angle got added, the department lost whatever room it had to soften the event. The legal office got involved next. That was predictable. A bad stop is one problem. A bad stop on a command officer with multiple video angles, prior complaints, and a weak report is a lawsuit package. Even if Andre chose not to sue, the department had to act like outside counsel might see every frame. They reviewed exposure for unlawful detention, unlawful search, and false statements in reporting. Voss was interviewed under administrative procedure. That interview went badly. He was asked to identify the exact point where the stop developed from traffic enforcement into criminal suspicion. He could not pin it down. He was asked what specific fact overrode the valid documents. He had no good answer. He was asked why refusal to consent seemed to change his behavior. He denied that it had, but the footage said otherwise. He was asked why he searched without calling for a canine, without waiting for a supervisor, and without a clear probable cause statement on audio first. That sequence trapped him. If he claimed urgency, the video did not support urgency. If he claimed probable cause, he could not articulate it. If he claimed officer safety, Andre had been compliant the entire time. Every route out closed on him. Then the prior incidents came back into the room. Investigators asked about earlier complaints where drivers described the same pattern: routine stop, quick suspicion, repeated questioning after documents cleared, pressure for consent, search logic that didn't match the facts. Voss tried to separate each case. That didn't work. Pattern cases are built exactly that way. One incident can look messy. 4 similar incidents look intentional. By mid-review, command wasn't deciding whether Voss had a future. They were deciding how to contain the fallout. That's the part a lot of people don't understand. Departments will tolerate bad judgment for a long time. They stop tolerating it when the officer becomes impossible to defend. Tyler Voss had crossed that line. He had weak facts, bad video, prior warnings, and a report that collapsed under comparison. No chief wants to stand in front of city leadership, local media, or a civil jury and explain why that officer was still on the street. Andre stayed mostly out of public view while the review moved. He gave his statement: preserve the evidence issue. Let the process work. That also made him harder to attack. Voss couldn't frame this as a power move by a superior officer using rank after the fact. Andre had actually done the opposite. He'd given Voss all the room in the world to treat him properly, and Voss had used that room to expose himself. One command-level memo summed up the problem in plain terms. Voss had treated personal suspicion like probable cause, and then tried to write the stop backward into legality after the fact. That was it. That was the whole case. The badge gave him authority. He supplied the misconduct himself. By the end of the week, the review file was no longer about corrective training or another warning. That option was dead. The recommendation moved toward termination, loss of police powers during the final process, and full preservation of records in case of outside inquiry. Tyler Voss had spent the stop trying to prove Andre Bennett did not belong in that vehicle. Now the department was preparing to prove Voss did not belong in uniform. The department moved quickly because it had no safe way to defend Tyler Voss. The stop was bad. The search was worse. The report made it final. Command reviewed the footage, the complaint history, and the administrative interview. Voss had already been warned before about aggressive stops and weak search justifications. This time, the evidence was too clean. He had ignored valid documents, extended the stop without legal grounds, searched the vehicle without probable cause, and then tried to write it up like the facts supported him. They stripped him of his badge and terminated him. The department also had to deal with the public side. Once word got out that the driver was Andre Bennett, the head of internal affairs, the story spread fast. Not because of his title alone, because people understood the bigger point right away. If an officer would do that to a command officer with valid documents, cameras rolling, and witnesses nearby, then regular people had probably been getting the same treatment for years, with less protection and less proof. That was the real damage. The bystander video circulated first. Then local outlets picked up the story. Then the department had to answer the question it hates most. Why was this officer still on the street after earlier complaints raised the same issues? That forced changes. Command ordered a review of Voss's prior stops. Supervisors were told to tighten review of consent searches and stop extensions. Internal Affairs flagged similar complaints for re-examination. Training got updated, but more important than training, supervisors were put on notice. Weak probable cause language was no longer going to slide just because an officer knew how to dress it up in a report. Andre kept his response controlled all the way through. He didn't make speeches. He didn't turn it into a public performance. He gave his statement, protected the record, and let the evidence do the work. That's why the ending hit as hard as it did. Tyler Voss thought the badge would carry his suspicion. It didn't. The video showed the truth. His history backed it up. His own report buried him. And the department had no choice but to make him the example. One stop, one bad decision chain. One officer convinced his instinct mattered more than the law.